Thanks, Robin. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to talk for not too long about this concept of modular course design. And I want to mention this graphic that I've thrown up here. This is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is kind of a catalog page or advertisement for one of the Sears homes, which were really kind of the original modular home, really popular in the early to mid 19th century. You literally would buy your house through a catalog. It would be delivered to you by train on pallets, and either you or somebody you hired would construct it. And you can see you basically were getting kind of a house in a box with room plans and different options that you could choose from. This was a really successful model for Sears for a while, and the houses are actually beautiful. If anybody has one and would like to sell one to me, I'd happily take it. But it gets at this whole idea of modularity. The reason why did Sears do this? Because they realized there was a real need for housing, affordable housing. But the modular approach allowed them to sort of use materials in really efficient ways, create new designs more easily, and get this in front of people quickly. So this is one of the modular home metaphors that I'll be talking about. But getting back to the idea of how this affects us in terms of course design, modular course design is nothing new. It's been around as long as people have been probably talking about course design. When I was looking around for resources for today, a lot of the literature I found was like from the 70s. So I'm not going to tell you anything really radical today about instructional design or course design, but a few of the benefits that are worth keeping in mind. One of the things that I like about all course design, but particularly this kind of course design, because there is a fair amount of structure that's required, is that it requires some intentional design and planning from you, which can seem like, oh, well, that's more work. But in many ways, that intentionality really can be a real benefit for you. If you're teaching courses that you've been teaching for a long time and maybe haven't had a moment to step back and really think about the structure or how things are organized in a while, consider different options or opportunities. This is a moment to do that. And because modular design does have a focus and emphasis on structure, it may help you to wrap your head around things that you've been doing in a different way. For your students, it creates potentially some order and predictability to how your course runs. At the foundation of modular design is this emphasis on sort of common structure and common architecture of your modules. And so your students, once they've gone through a module or two, begin to sort of know what's expected of them, what to anticipate, how to work within the boundaries that you've set up of that module or the space that you've set up for that module. It can increase flexibility, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but potentially for our fall 2020 scenarios, this is something that could be really useful for us and for our students. And another thing I'll be talking about is that there's the potential, depending on how you approach modular design, for remixing, reusing, repurposing modules in different contexts and different courses, collaborating with colleagues who are teaching courses that are related both within your discipline or perhaps within your cluster. So there's a way in which this sort of could underpin some of our goals with cluster learning and cluster teaching. So this is a different kind of modular home you're looking at, obviously a more modern architecture, but sort of, I think, visually emphasizes this point of creating a whole out of smaller pieces that could potentially be reorganized in interesting ways, but the pieces themselves are fairly discrete and self-contained. So what is a course module? There's nothing magical about this. It can be defined as, this is a definition from a Boise State piece that we'll be sharing. A module can be defined as a unit, chapter, topic, or segment of instruction. It's a standard unit or instructional section of your course that's self-contained, or sometimes it's called as a chunk of instruction. We talk about chunking a lot in instructional design, in particular with modular course design. So these,
Martha, do you mind if I interrupt for a moment? I'm just trying to understand this. Am I supposed to be creating flexible modules for for all my courses this fall, I don't even know where to start.
Thank you, Professor X. I should have known that I would not be immune to your rejoinders. No, you do not need to create modules for everything that you teach this fall. And I want to, similarly to what Robin emphasized with HighFlex, point out and assure you that our philosophy here is that you should do what makes sense for you in the courses that you're teaching. This is just one approach that you may find useful. It may help you to consider what your options are for the fall. Some of you may already be doing, I'm sure many of you are already doing something like this, if not this exact thing in your courses. And so this may not seem like anything really new at all. But there's definitely no expectation that you take all your courses today and you turn them into Sears homes or this modern architecture of reusable chunks of content or of instruction. But let's talk about how you might approach the designing of a course module. And there's really no one approach to this. I'll show you an example of one path through this. But this piece of it is the most important thing. This is really the thing that you need to do. This step is really what you need to do before you even get started, and as you're thinking about how this might work for you, which is like taking the entire universe of your course, everything that embodies, your learning objectives, the content that you've either created or found that you share with students, the assignments or assessments that you rely on, any kind of self-reflection that you have built in, your own mechanisms for providing feedback to students, thinking about all of those things and disaggregating them to a certain degree and figuring out how you could chunk them up in ways that make sort of logical sense. Typically, when we talk about chunking a course to create course modules, we focus on things like content or themes. So if you teach thematically, you might have a module about each of the themes that you cover. If you proceed through various schools of a discipline, you might have modules around those various schools. What's a little bit different in our context and what we want people to really consider and why we're really presenting about this at all is if there are pieces of your course that have really specific requirements, particularly around specific modalities. This might be an opportunity to pull all of those things together and create a single module out of those requirements. So for example, if you do a course that has a heavy experiential learning component, some kinds of activities that you do where you really do need to be face-to-face, either on campus or off campus, and typically you might disperse those throughout the semester, maybe for logistical reasons, maybe for sequencing reasons. Is there a way, and it may not be possible for everybody, but is there a way that you could create a single module where all of that is grouped together? And the advantage to that obviously would be that if we come back in the fall face-to-face, but for whatever reason that has to be discontinued, if you forefronted that face-to-face module, the module that has those requirements at the beginning of the semester, it might give you more flexibility later in the semester. You could even do this in a way where maybe you don't create modules for your entire course, but you create one module that you're going to start your course with, where you put in all of that stuff, the stuff that really, truly you feel there's no way you could replicate this through easily through online mechanisms. You really want to have your students present face-to-face. Maybe that's the thing that you start the semester with, and then you proceed into the rest of your course and the rest of your more standard sequence of content and assignments that you run. This is just, like I said, one approach to designing it. There's nothing radical or particularly interesting about this. For many of you, it will look familiar. There's sort of a backwards design to creating modules, which is that you start with your learning outcomes. What is it that you want students to be able to demonstrate or show you? Then what assignments and assessments can you create that will help your students show you what they've learned? What learning materials do you need to assemble? What's the structure and sequence that you want students to progress through as they complete a module? And finally, what instructions might students need? Because this may be new to them if you've never taught this way before. what instructions do they need in order to understand how the module is organized and what the expectation is in terms of their own participation in classwork and getting things done. I mentioned earlier that one of the advantages to modularity that we talk about a lot is this idea of structure. And usually when we talk about modular course design, there's a real emphasis on consistency of structure, so that your students begin to know and anticipate what they could, what constitutes a module. So as they finish one module and start another module, they begin to learn not just the course material, but they begin to learn a little bit about the design of your course and how it runs, helping them to be more successful as they proceed through the class. This is just one example. I'm not going to read it to you of a kind of course module structure that you could use, but there is no right structure for a course module. What's important is that you create a structure that works for you and what it is that you need to be doing in a module, and that you try as best you can to be consistent with that structure for the rest of the semester. So a couple of things to be considering, kind of do's and don'ts as you tackle this idea of modular design, if you decide that's something you want to do. As I mentioned before, focus on consistency of structure so students learn what to expect and can be more successful. Don't overload your modules. This is kind of an important one. If you decide that you're really going to chunk up your entire class and do this with discrete modules, think about keeping the scope reasonable. So you wouldn't have, like one 2-week module and one 13-week module. You might do a 2-week module and then just the rest of your course. But the idea of modules really works if they're balanced in terms of how much is covered and how much you are asking students to achieve within the confines of a module. Do, as I mentioned, think about building your module around modality requirements. So putting the stuff that requires students to be face-to-face together. Don't forget, this is kind of important. Sometimes when we start down this path of modular course design, it's easy to start to feel like you're getting really instrumental, that you're starting to move toward a little bit more towards the competency-based online instruction that Robin has talked about before, which is fine, but not necessarily the way that we tend to think about pedagogy and teaching at PSU. So it's not necessarily that you want to create something where you give a student a module and they just take it and run with it and proceed through it and you hear back from them at the end when they're done. You still want to bake into it and leave space in your modular design for student exploration, for changing direction based upon students' interests and needs. You don't need to be wholly prescriptive. It's really more about creating a space and a structure for the experience of learning than it is about, it can be more about creating a space and structure for the experience of learning than about having students walk lockstep through some kind of path that you've predetermined for them. This is an important one. Think about how you could build modules. Getting back to Amy's question earlier, and I know what's on a lot of people's minds, which is, my God, how do we handle workload when we're trying to plan for all these different possible scenarios? Are there modules that you could create or you could co-create with colleagues in your discipline or in your cluster that could cross some boundaries between courses? Maybe as the entire module is something that could be shared if you're covering similar kinds of information, similar kinds of themes or content in different courses. Maybe it's the kind of thing where you collaborate on the at the outset, and then maybe take it in different directions to customize it for your particular course. Maybe it's a module that you create for one of your courses that's a more introductory course, but then you teach a more advanced course that's related, and you start with that introductory module and then develop a more advanced version out of it by remixing or reusing stuff that you've already done. As I think Robin has tried to emphasize throughout this morning, we really are trying to suggest practices and ways forward that are not about just a ton of one-off work for fall 2020 that you'll never touch again or never look at again after that. So this may be the kind of thing that you could use this as an opportunity, as much as I hate to use that word right now, as an opportunity to create some resources for yourself, some pedagogical resources and approaches for yourself with modular learning that in the future could benefit your future classes. Even if you create a module now that's related to a class you're not teaching in the fall, you use it this fall, and then you could reuse it in a different class that's related in the spring or next year. So have an eye as you're doing this towards the idea of reusability and repurposing. And finally, don't get, this is a hard one, and it won't, you know, it's one I hesitate to say, because I think a lot of people will probably say, well, that feels really difficult, to not get too bogged down in sequencing. So one of the advantages to approaching a course in terms of these discrete modules is that you have the possibility and potential to reorganize your modules as the situation at PSU changes. So if we're on campus and then we're gone, or we have to leave.
Martha, like, how, like, am I supposed to let go of like the natural sequencing in my courses? It's like natural. It's required in my program to get through all the content, and like, learning is sequencing, dude.
You know, it's interesting, Professor X, because the visage that you're showing me right now is not necessarily the persona of somebody who I would think is really bogged down in sequencing. But obviously, you know, I won't read too much into that. So sequencing in a course is something some of us have spent a lot of time figuring out. This is the way that we want our students to progress through the experience of this course. This is what's worked in the past. This is reinforced by our discipline. It may be reflected in other courses that students have to take later, or required in some of the courses that students take later. Letting go of that rhythm and sequencing that we've spent a lot of time developing. It may be how we learned, and so it feels really natural to us to continue with that same sequence as we go forward. I understand that. And so I would say, if you're teaching a class where that sequencing really feels just sort of woven into the fabric of how that course needs to be taught, into how that discipline tends, or by tradition teaches that class, it may be really difficult to disaggregate and reshuffle things. But maybe you teach some courses where this is an opportunity to step back from some of what you've been doing, some practices that you might have been taking on without really reflecting on them, and ask yourself, is that sequencing really required? Is there a creative way of reshuffling the course that you've never thought about before, that this might be a time when you could do that? Again, as with everything that we've said, we're not suggesting that you take on or do something that feels really unnatural, that feels really uncomfortable, and that, most importantly, you feel like, I will fail at this, and not only will I fail, my students will not succeed because of it. Back away from those things. Investigate and research what you're interested in and what looks promising, and figure out what pieces of this you can take forward that you feel like could help you address the uncertainty in the fall, and maybe help you build some things that going forward could be useful to you, and to maybe your collaborations with other faculty and colleagues at PSU. Oops, it clicked away. Professor X distracted me. All right, so that's kind of it for modular course design. Like I said, there's nothing really terribly magical about that, or progressive, but maybe it's given you an opportunity to think about some things a little bit differently that might be happening in your courses. I want to take time to answer a few questions if there are any.
And if it's possible, we're going to be ending soon, so try not to leave, because I think the last couple of things after this are important if possible. So questions for Martha or the world?
I have a question.
Go ahead, person.
Oh, this is Anne Jung Matthews from the library.
I am.
So two things. I feel like we need to have, the librarians need to get together with you to talk about how this can, these ideas can work in library instruction. And I'll just leave that there because that's will be all, or information literacy units, that will all have to be rediscussed. But what I really wanted to ask you that maybe you can answer now is where does the modular, where do modular, does modular course design and high flex like come together? I'm seeing in them right now as really distinct things, but where do they meet?
Well, I would say it would be great. So let me just say, if I were doing this, I would probably think about designing a pretty high flex approach for all of my courses for fall. And I would change that as I got more information later in the summer, and the high flex would allow me to start building for 3 modalities and then gradually reduce that if we get more information. But I think it's going to be hard not to be prepared for pretty high flex environments. But I will tell you what I would also do is I would chunk into modules based on primarily modalities. So if I knew I had certain things that worked much better in face-to-face, I would create a module for that so that I could offer it at a certain time in the semester when we are face-to-face, for example, right at the beginning. And then if it turns out that we aren't face-to-face, I would take that highly face-to-face module, move it to the end, start my high flex course, and as I was designing, figure out what to do with that face-to-face module, which would probably be a combination of canceling certain things, which will have to go, and then redesigning. So I think you could use them that way. Once the COVID is over, I think you could use this in really cool ways, and the kinds of things that Amy has been sort of raising today in the chat and in public on the call, would be to think about if you design just a high flex module somewhere in your class, professors can first of all share the teaching load of that module. So it might be that one professor could teach that module simultaneously in 2 or 3 classes or sections. So that would reduce workload, but it might also be that you could use that in cluster collaborations where you take just one high flex module for say 3 weeks and do a cluster oriented project across say 3 sections, or for things like themed gen ed, instead of using just the face-to-face scheduling, you could use high flex to design modules that would allow you to come together. So I think, you know, sometimes the full high flex course is a lot, especially after COVID-19, but taking small chunks of high flex might deal with things like workload, interdisciplinarity, collaboration, projects, clusters in really exciting ways.